Oh, all right. Crazy stat. In 2024, nearly 1 in 3 Americans still believe the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. It's wild, right? Check this out.
Okay, so let me ask you, how old is the Earth?
Okay, so let's apply that principle. The historical record actually tells us.
Yep.
Tells us that God created everything in 6 days. Adam was created on the 6th day of creation. It tells us that Adam was 130 years old when his son Seth was born, and Seth was 105 when his son Enos was born, and they're all the way down to Noah. And it says in the 600th year of Noah's life, the flood took place. You can just add those numbers up. They're all there in Genesis chapter 5.
Yep.
You don't have to be a rocket scientist to do it. It's straightforward. In fact, I get my grandchildren to do it as an exercise when they get to their 10th birthday. I sit down and we build a timeline of Bible history.
Wow.
And you'll discover that the flood occurred 1,656 years after the creation. And then you can follow on and discover that Abraham was born about 2,000 years after the creation. From Abraham to Jesus is about 2,000 years. We know that scripturally and also from history. And from the time of Jesus to the present day is about 2,000 years. So if you add those up, according to the Bible, and this is not my idea, here we are about 6,000 years after the creation.
If that made you stop and think, you're certainly in the right place. Okay, so in this video, I'm tracing how it all evolved, from early church thinkers to courtroom showdowns and the political movements that kept it alive. By the end, you'll see why creationism isn't just about religion, it's about how America understands itself. But the real reason it took hold runs deeper than you might imagine. In 2024, Gallup released a new report showing just how deeply creationist ideas still shape American beliefs. And those numbers might really surprise you. Let's rewind a bit and see how we got here. Creationism still holds surprising influence in modern America, but how did beliefs like this remain so widespread? In 2024, the American polling organisation Gallup released a new report on how Americans view creation and the origins of the universe. This came 5 years after a similar report that Gallup had carried out in 2019. The results showed a shift in thinking, though not a large one. This is incredible. 37% of the American polls stated that they held some form of creationist belief. That is, that they believe that Earth and humanity came into existence as a result of something akin to what is described in the book of Genesis, while also contending that creation occurred within the last approximately 10,000 years. This compared with just 24% who unequivocally expressed a belief in Darwinism and the scientific view of evolution of human beings according to natural selection over a period of millions of years. The remainder held mixed views, despite the contradictions in trying to reconcile a religious and scientific view of creation. There is a decline here from a peak of around 47% of Americans that expressed a belief in creationism, right around the year 2000, when polled by Gallup at the time. Yet, whether the 2000 figures or the 2024 figures are examined, the numbers are still striking. 1 in 3 Americans hold some form of creationist belief. Here I look at how this happened and also differentiate between how Young Earth Creationism has emerged into modern America as a distinct form of creationism. The numbers reveal the persistence of belief. To understand why, we have to trace its roots. Where did creationism come from, and why did it endure so long despite scientific progress? The broader creationist movement is very old. It dates back to about the 17th century, though there have been writers querying the age of the world and creation based on biblical scripture. And this goes back as long as Christians have been writing. For instance, the early 5th century bishop of Hippo, St Augustine, believed that the creation story in the book of Genesis should primarily be understood as a parable for how God had created the world and humanity, not as literal versions of events at the dawn of creation. So he did not believe that the world had been created by God in 6 days, but that he had laid down the seeds of future creation, and this is significant. Augustine was one of the church fathers who shaped Christian scholarship and the interpretation of the Bible for thousands of years. He is still held in immense regard by Christian theologians and scholars today. The very fact that he was pondering the creation story in Genesis as early as around the year 400 was important. Augustine's questioning of the account of creation found in the book of Genesis was actually quite rational. He was leaning towards the idea that the creation of the world in just 6 days was implausible. He wanted to caveat it by saying that the Genesis account was more of a metaphor than a literal rendering of creation. Alright, later Christian theologians followed Augustine's rational approach, though it was in a more of a particular way. There were two key figures here, both of whom were writing in the middle of the 17th century, within a few years of each other. In 1644, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, a theologian by the name of John Lightfoot, published a book entitled The Harmony of Four Evangelists. In this, he calculated, based on the study of the supposed passage of time in the Old Testament, that biblical creation had occurred in the year 3929 BC. Lightfoot was followed a decade later by the Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland, Dr. James Ussher, who collaborated Lightfoot's thesis and dated creation to 4004 BC. Both Lightfoot and Ussher arrived at their conclusions by adding up the extensive genealogies of the first generations of men and women descended from Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis and the approximate time it would have taken for the other events in the Old Testament to take place to arrive at their dating system. Now, Ussher's version is more well known, and creationism generally dated creation to 4004 BC going forward. In some senses, there was little to argue against in the 17th century. Virtually everyone in Europe was a Christian, though intense wars were being fought over what kind of Christian. Indeed, the scientific revolution was underway, but there was little knowledge of how old the Earth might be from a scientific perspective, and almost nothing was known about scientific evolution at the time. It was not until the advent of the theory of natural selection, Darwinism, and the discovery of fossils and other remains that indicated that the world was hundreds of thousands of years old, perhaps even millions. In the 19th century, the creationism ran into a major counter-argument. By the second half of the 19th century, as religious belief declined and the new age of science and reason took hold everywhere, creationism was increasingly discredited. It was passionately defended by the Bishop of Winchester, Samuel Wilberforce, a prominent opponent of Darwinism, who engaged successfully in a debate against Thomas Huxley, a defender of Darwin, in a famous debate in Oxford in 1860. Contemporaries concluded there was no clear winner of this debate, but creationism was on the decline anyway in Britain, as Darwinism and scientific rationalism spread in Britain. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw creationism dying out to a large extent in the Old World. Instead, it found a home in the New World, and in particular, the United States of America. America had gone through several religious revivals in the 18th and 19th centuries, known as the First, Second, and Third Great Awakenings. And these awakenings had many great outcomes. Some had led to a simple intensification of religious fervour, while in other cases entirely new religions had emerged, notably Mormonism, which developed towards the end of the Second Great Awakening. And belief in creationism intensified as the result of the Third Great Awakening, which ran roughly from 1860 to 1930, and which included the American response to Darwin's theory of evolution. In more religiously inclined states in the South, there was a movement to try to block the acceptance of Darwinism and to promote creationism. Perhaps the most striking example of this was in Tennessee, where the Butler Act was passed in 1925, basically prohibiting school teachers from teaching anything that conflicted with the account of creation found in the book of Genesis. This led quickly to the well-known Scopes trial, in which John Scopes, a school teacher, was prosecuted for violating the Butler Act. The Scopes trial became a symbol of the clash between faith and science, and it set the stage for creationism's next transformation in the United States. After the Scopes trial, creationism seemed finished. So how did a new version rise again in the modern era? Creationism then had found purchase in the United States by the 20th century, but a slightly different strain of it began to emerge in the aftermath of the Second World War, and in particular during the 1960s, 70s and 80s, a period of American religious history sometimes known as the Fourth Great Awakening. By the start of this period, creationism had to try to reconcile itself with the widespread belief in scientific evolution and Darwinism. For instance, creationism was seen as a kind of religious adjunct to the evolution theory for more rationalist Christians. This approach would soon become known as Old Earth Creationism. The distinction developed as a more aggressive form of creationism emerged in America in the 60s and 70s. And the turning point was the publication in 1961 of The Genesis Flood, The Biblical Records and Its Scientific Implications, a book by John Whitcomb and Henry Morris. Whitcomb was a theologian, while Morris was more of a scientifically minded engineer. Despite Morris's background, their objective was to explain away the myriad scientific evidence that refuted creationist theory. In the book, they focus on the biblical flood, that Noah was said to have built his ark in response to an order to preserve humanity and animal life, while the rest of the world was flooded. Whitcomb and Morris developed an argument that this flood had actually happened around 4,500 years ago, and that its impact could explain things like fossil remains and so forth, that would otherwise be used by scientists to explain the evolution of the Earth and humanity over approximately 4.5 billion years. So the Genesis flood set off a new Young Earth Creationist movement. Its adherents followed Whitcomb and Morris in proposing pseudo-scientific theories that reconciled establishing science with their core belief that the Earth and humanity are somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. Young Earth creationists do hold strictly that Ussher's idea of creation occurred in 4004 BC, but they do use a date about 6,000 years ago as a general point of reference. Young Earth creationism grew substantially in popularity in the period that followed, driven by new organisations like the Institute for Creation Research that Henry Morris, the co-author of The Genesis Flood, established in the 70s. And Creation Ministries International, an organisation launched in 1977 to actively promote and grow belief in young Earth creationism. Although creationism peaked in popularity in 1999, it has remained a feature of American religious life ever since, as the Gallup Poll of 2024 clearly indicates. By reinventing itself through new leaders and organisations, creationism survived, re-emerging as Young Earth Creationism, a powerful modern movement. So why did Young Earth Creationism flourish, particularly in the United States, while fading elsewhere? After all, creationism has been around for a long time. It is particular that this different branch of it suddenly exploded in popularity in the United States in the 70s and 80s. And there may be a clear reason why. This was an era in which the Cold War changed shape. The US and the Soviets had been genuine rivals in the 50s and the 60s. The Soviets, for instance, were ahead in the space race until the very last hurdle when the US piped them to the moon. And in the Far East, one nation after another seemed to be going over the communist cause between 1945 and 1970. It was a very different situation in the 1970s and the 1980s as the Soviet economy went into persistent stagnation and the US raced forward. In particular, under Ronald Reagan, after he became president of the US in 1981, there was a renewed drive by the Americans to win the Cold War. This emerged with the development of a kind of new right-wing Christian political ideology in America, one that Reagan was a firm advocate of. Young Earth Creationism found a lot of purchase as a result, especially so since American Christianity stood in such a sharp contrast to the atheism of Soviet communism. I mean, it is entirely plausible that the part of the reasons for the growth of right-wing Christian politics and young earth creationism in the US in the 1980s was owing to a certain section of American society forging political and religious identity in direct opposition to the Soviets at the time. This form of Christian fundamentalism subsequently found other movements to identify itself in opposition to and after the Cold War, be it the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East around the time of the 9/11 attacks, or later the liberals, that right-wing Christians identify in opposition within the current American culture wars. Thus, young earth creationism might well be something which has just developed as a part of the politics of the right in modern United States. In the end, young earth creationism thrived because it became more than a belief. It became identity, politics, culture, all intertwined. Alright, to delve more into these topics and the complexity of Christian history, be sure to tune into other videos on the channel and subscribe to hear about new releases. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one.
Got a God complex. Haters love to hate, but I never feel pressed. Got a lot on my plate, but I never get stressed.